Hey guys, it's Dr. May. How are you? Welcome today. It's Sunday, so I'll call this Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Sunday, kind of an alliteration. I'm going to talk to you today about some more working with memory skills, and this one's specifically called a sliver of memory. All right, so let me share my screen. Okay, so this one I'll dedicate to the late, great Grandma J, because my grandma, if offered dessert after dinner, she would always say, I'll just have a sliver, right? So she was asked for have a cake. You know, if you already ate dinner and you want to have cake, if you ate the whole thing, it would be totally overwhelming, right? You would be so full and oh my God. But if you just had a little sliver of cake, right, you could manage it. You could probably squeeze it in at the end, right? So when we're working with memory, if you dealt with the entire memory at once and all the gory details were piling on, you probably would feel completely overwhelmed. But if you took just a sliver of the memory, just a little bit, just enough to activate the feelings and the building blocks associated with it, it becomes so much more manageable. And that's what today's is going to be all about. So it helps you have more control over the working with memory process. So you could think of it as the sliver, like these slivers of cake, okay? All right, so just defining it a little bit more. So what is a sliver of memory? Okay, so it's really just like a piece of the memory that you want to work with, okay? It's like a piece, like let's say the entire cake is the whole memory. So you just want to take a little slice of it or a little sliver of it and work with that piece, okay? So it could be an important element, something that stands out to you. And it's just enough that it'll help bring about a similar feeling, a similar state that you experienced at the time. So you don't have to go through the whole thing, just a little bit, okay? And it should activate your building blocks enough that you can work with it, but not overwhelm you, okay? So here's the main thing. So if you join me for my previous video about dual awareness, this is a build on of that concept. Okay, so in dual awareness, we talked about activating the past and then monitoring our building blocks in the present, and then using our resources where necessary in order to keep us inside of our window of tolerance or a comfortable area of activation of arousal. I'm sorry, I'm missing the word for a second. So the variation here is we're just going to make sure we take a sliver of the memory from the past, a piece of it, and then do the other pieces that we talked about in the previous video, okay? So here's some examples of slivers of memory, just to make it a little bit more clear. So let's say in the first picture up on the left, you were the little girl, and you had a very upsetting experience with your parents in the car about something. So you think about that incident, and it becomes very upsetting to you. So how could you just narrow it down and focus on a sliver just to start with? So a sliver could be the tone of voice of your parents that just sticks out in your mind. Or it could be maybe something that they said, like a word or a phrase that they said to you, like, what's the matter with you? And that's the thing that really gets to you, right? That's an important sliver. It could be the feeling that you had, maybe the feeling of being trapped between these two big, powerful people and how you felt like you couldn't get out of the car. That could be the sliver. It could be the scenery in front of the car that you were looking at while this interaction was going on. Or it could be just the look of disapproval on their faces. See how each one of those things is just a slice of the pie. And it's not the whole picture, but it's enough that it could get you to kind of feel the feelings of the memory and then start to work them through. Okay, the bottom example. I know it's a cartoon, but it's something that a lot of us might have gone through, right? Being maybe bullied or teased by peers, maybe on a bus ride to school, for example. So let's say you're the girl on the left, okay? And then there's other kids in the bus that are bothering you. So maybe the thing that jumps out the sliver is the mean look in the girl's eyes. Let's say the girl in the purple, okay? Or thinking that your friend was going to help you. Maybe the friend is the one in the orange sweatshirt, but the friend did nothing. And that's the piece that bothered you. Maybe it was some other sensory element of the scene. Maybe it was the smell of the bubble gum, or the smell of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, or the smell of bus exhaust, right? Or it could have been the way you were staring at the seat in front of you and looking at the designs in the vinyl, okay? It could have been something that stood out that kind of brings this memory about for you. Okay, so when you select a sliver of memory to work with using these techniques, it's important to pick one that takes you to the edges of your window of tolerance. So something that sparks some hyperarousal, but doesn't completely overwhelm you, or makes you start to shut down and disconnect and dissociate, but not too much, just a tiny bit, okay? So you still want to have your thinking brain online to help you. So you need enough neocortex, prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, to stay mindful of your building blocks. You don't want to just totally zone out and lose your mind, or get so dysregulated with your emotional mind that you can't think, okay? So you got to be dysregulated, but not too dysregulated. That's the key. So you have to pick the right sliver of memory that'll keep you still in your window of tolerance, all right? Otherwise, you won't be able to integrate the memory. It's just going to make you feel upset, and that's not really going to help anything. Okay, so here's a few tips for avoiding hyperarousal, okay? So you don't get overly anxious or overly dysregulated or overly upset and, frantic, okay? First, you want to take the thinnest of the slices, okay? Sometimes it's even thinking about the memory. It's the name of a person involved, or it could be just like the town you were in. Like, it could be something super small that you're starting with, and that's okay. Start with the smallest slice, okay? Start with a slice that isn't too bad, all right? A less provocative slice or sliver. I'm sorry, I'm using the terms interchangeably because, you think of cake, you think slice, sliver, okay. Go slowly, take your time. Remember, you can use resources at any time or stop at any time. I mean, obviously, we want you to go through the process so that you could get the benefit of integrating the memory. But if you have to stop, then stop, okay? Or do it another day. It's important to practice that dual awareness, going back and forth between being mindful of the present and how it's activating your building blocks and the memory, right? So you want to stay in that arrow that kind of goes across as I showed you here. Okay. Whoa, okay. And then if you have a therapist, it's good to work with a therapist on this, because in addition to self-monitoring your reaction, a therapist could kind of help you along and guide you as to, like, when to use your resources, when to stop, what to notice, and you have that support of another person. So if it's possible, if you have a therapist, you could do it with a therapist, but you could also try this by yourself if you feel like you have adequate resources to handle it. Okay, so here's a few more tips. One, in order to make the slice thinner and a little bit less triggering, especially if it's a very triggering memory, you could imagine the scene as being very far away. So let's say in that first picture, you imagine staying way across the room and watching it on that television way across the room. So there's more distance between you and the memory, and then therefore less of a strong reaction. You could also think of it in terms of percentages rather than all or nothing, okay? Because part of this, the sliver, is that this isn't an all or nothing process. So what if you allowed yourself to feel 1% of the memory, right? Or just, a tiny teaspoon of it, just a little teeny bit. And you could even make it time limited. What if you allowed yourself to feel it for a short period of time, like let's say 15 seconds, and then you were willing to move on and do some resources, right? So just give yourself like a little bit, okay? Just tiny bits at a time to make this a manageable, regulating process, okay? So that you don't get overwhelmed. So it gives you that, again, that good sense of power and control and competence. Okay, so if the memory tends to shift you into hyperarousal, so when you start to think about it, you shut down, you dissociate, you zone out, you curl up in a ball. That's another thing we could look at. So you don't want to get so hyperaroused, so disoriented, so dissociated that you can't integrate the memory. So one thing to keep in mind is prepare movement resources, because when you shut down, it's an immobile response. It means that you're not really moving. You're kind of curled up in a ball like the girl in the picture. So you want to be able to think, well, how would I want to move? How could I reactivate myself to get back into the window of tolerance by movement? So could I walk around the room? Could I rock? Can I stretch? Can I, do some kind of motion that's going to keep me from zoning out all the way? That's going to keep me a little bit up. Okay. So that's a really important thing to prepare so that you could handle it when it happens. Okay. So sometimes the memory isn't necessarily traumatic. It could be some relational issue that you had with your family or with some other people. So it may not be something that gets you so dysregulated one way or the other, but it's something that you still want to work through. So you could still take slices of memory related to relationship issues. So maybe like a fight with your parents, or the atmosphere in the house, or the way someone showed you disapproval or invalidation, right? So you may want to go through those and do those with a slice of memory, okay? And you might want to pick the kind of memories that maybe shape the way you feel about yourself now, such as like, I don't think I'm worth anything. Well, where did that slice come from? Where did that belief come from? It came from some older memory, perhaps with attachment figures, with your parents, with other important people in your life. And you could work through that belief now by dealing with some of the slices of memory and how that's impacting you, okay? So you could find some potent emotional slivers that kind of bring that back to the present and then work with the building blocks and the resources now. All right. Sometimes a dilemma is you don't have really clear explicit memories. Like maybe something happened because you were told it. Maybe you were very little when something happened and you just don't remember it, or you blocked it out in some kind of a way. When you're very traumatized, your brain doesn't always process the memory in a conscious verbal manner, but something happened because you feel it, because you have the implicit memories about certain things. So that's still okay. You can still work with the aftermath of the stuff now. So it might be, the sliver might be just knowing what the thing is that happened. Maybe you know that you were sexually abused, but you don't remember it. But just thinking about that, the words of it, is a part of the sliver. Or maybe thinking about the impact of how that is now is part of the sliver, okay? So you could still be creative with this process, even if you don't have a really clear, explicit memory, okay? So that's again, remembering it in words, remembering it in specific images, like it may just be more vague to you, maybe it's more of a feeling, okay? All right, so I have some exercises for us to try if you're interested. All right, so let's say you want to work through a difficult memory, all right? Maybe what you could do to start is just to identify different slivers of that memory, okay? So you could write these down and maybe rate them, okay, based on how they impact you now. So there might be some slivers that are not very problematic. Maybe they're kind of somewhere in your window of tolerance and they don't bother you too much. Maybe there's some more disturbing slivers that increase your arousal and make you more clearly upset. Maybe there are some that need you to shut down a little bit more. So just identify the different slivers and put a number on them. See on the left of this diagram here, they're kind of rated from 5, meaning very strong hyperarousal, all the way down to -5, which is very strong hypoarousal. Okay. And some of them might actually be slivers that are resources, because we've talked about that before. Maybe there's some things you remember that, wow, I really did something positive to survive the situation. So that might be a positive sliver. Okay. Not every sliver is a bad one. Okay. But just to start out, you could identify what these slivers are. Okay. All right. So now that you identified some slivers, we could practice a little bit. So select one of the slivers that takes you to the outer edge of your window of tolerance. So, again, your mind is still available to you. You're still able to be mindful, but you're feeling some of the impact on your building blocks, right? So your building blocks in the present are still activated, but not so much that you can't be mindful of how it's being activated. Okay, so you could think about, as you're noticing the sliver, how is it impacting my 5 senses, my thoughts, my emotions, the way my body is moving or wants to move, and my body sensations. Okay, so just mindfully notice one by one. And then if it's making you feel dysregulated, then go to your resources at any time, which are down here. Okay, And you could do this in advance if you want, you could, or just in the moment. So try 3 different resources just to practice, to see how it could start to regulate the way the sliver have activated your resources. So if they brought you up to hyperarousal, which resources can now bring you back into your more comfortable zone of arousal in your window of tolerance? Okay, so in previous lessons, we discussed these in more detail, and hopefully you've developed your own inventory of resources, so they should be a little more accessible to you at this point. If not, you could always go back and do that at any time. So just to review, the key resource categories include relational resources, somatic, emotional, intellectual, artistic, material, psychological, spiritual, and nature. So if you've done the original work, you should have lists of things in each of those categories that are both internal and external that could help you cope when you're in a hyperarousal mode or a hypoarousal mode. So I want you to pull out 3 of them to help you deal with the sliver of memory that you're choosing to activate here, okay? And after you activate them, notice again, how are your building blocks impacted, okay? Hopefully it'll help you get back into the window of tolerance, but notice specifically what that means in your different building blocks, what changes. Okay, so now specifically the change in this exercise here is instead of just using any resource from any of these categories, I want you to specifically focus on somatic resources, okay? So try to use a somatic resource to calm your body down when you activate a sliver of memory in the present, okay? So you're still gonna start out the same way. You're gonna activate the sliver, notice how that sliver is impacting your building blocks. And then to help calm down your building blocks into your window of tolerance, you're going to try a somatic resource, such as breathing, connecting with your back, such as by pressing your back against the chair, pushing your feet into the floor as a grounding exercise, aligning your spine, self-soothing, such as self-hugging, rocking, doing some kind of movement or comforting gesture, okay? Using containment resources, such as wrapping yourself in a blanket or swaddling, and putting your hand on your heart, hand on your belly, which is a centering resource, okay? So try some of those and see how those then impact your building blocks after you activate the sliver of memory. Okay, so another thing you can try, so remember you picked some different slivers. So now you wanna practice oscillating or going back and forth between distressing slivers of memory and some positive slivers or resources that happened during that same incident. So going back and forth and then noticing how that oscillation impacts your building blocks. So I'm going to use the example I used in a previous video of my car accident from 2006. So I was in a serious car accident, high-speed car accident, driving down to Maryland. And some of the distressing slivers are the out of control feeling I had when the car crashed into the truck and being dragged by the truck. So it's just that sense of being pulled out of control and being dragged around the road, which was very upsetting to me. And I had PTSD for about a year about that and constantly had that image and that feeling. So it definitely had an impact on my building blocks. The other piece was being alone on the side of the road with the traffic whizzing by on I-95. So those are the ones that are very distressing to me. And also, which I forgot to put here, just not knowing what was wrong with me because I knew I was hurt, but I didn't know how much. Okay, so those are the distressing slivers for me in that particular incident. So if I rotated, some of the positive slivers for me were when I was almost out of the hospital, waiting in the waiting room to be picked up. And I was talking with a few guys who were veterans of Afghanistan, and they were telling me some stories, and they were kind of fun, and they had like, you know, a pretty good mood. So that cheered me up a little bit. And being in my street clothes, knowing I was going to go, knowing I was going to be okay. So those are some positive slivers of memory for me, right? So I could go back and forth between thinking about the moment when I crashed into the truck and going back to the part where I was almost out of the hospital. And that kind of going back and forth starts to regulate me and bring me back into my window of tolerance, okay? But here's the progression of steps. I'm gonna go down to the bottom here. So 1, select a painful memory you want to explore. 2, identify a distressing sliver and a resource from the same memory. 3, notice your building blocks for each sliver, right? So as you focus on each one separately, notice your building blocks. And then as you go back and forth, keep noticing your building blocks. So as you go back and forth, the distressing sliver may not activate your building blocks in as distressing of a manner, right? So having that influence of the positive on the negative starts to make the distressing one less distressing. All right, it's a really good skill. Okay. All right. Next. Okay, so remember before I mentioned that you can use this skill to deal with relational experiences that were painful, attachment experiences with key caregivers and people in your life, such as parents. So this could be also used for that situation. So you could think about a sliver of memory with an attachment figure that bothers you, and then think about how, well, notice how it impacts your building blocks, okay? And if you have trouble really feeling it strongly because you feel a little bit more detached from the situation, you could use some of the techniques for deepening your memory so you can feel it, so your building blocks are activated. So we've discussed this in past videos as well, but just a quick review. So if you don't feel like, you know, it's bringing you to the edge of your window of tolerance and you feel kind of bland about it, but you know it's still affecting your life now, try to do the opposite of disconnecting or detaching. So if you feel like you're very still, start to move. If you feel like, you know, you're not too into it, try to think about a more distressing slice of it to kind of make it more real for you. Increase the emotion. Think about the thoughts that have been most impacted by it, or the slice of and what you're thinking about at the time to make it more alive for you. So try to wake up those building blocks, and then wherever you need it, you could always use a resource. But if it's too disconnected, you got to make it alive first, okay? But just keep in mind that you could also use this for attachment experiences as well as general trauma experiences. All right, so that's that. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed our sliver of memory. Feel free to give it a try. And you don't have to do this with the most traumatic thing in your life ever. You could practice it with something more benign. So you could work your way up to it. As always, feel free to pace yourself, take your time, you know, be in control of the process. All right, more to come about memory soon, guys, and I will see you in the next video. All right, be good, take care.